Hey folks, Phil Gallagher of ThrabenU for another primer. Today's primer was funded by an anonymous donor, and if you are interested in having a primer made about another deck, $20 is my flat rate for doing so. Details in the comments, or the little box before comments. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, so today's primer is going to be on Titanic Dryad, also sometimes called like a green Stompy deck, or Titan Stompy, or something of that general nature. The deck list has changed a little bit over time, but just to give you an idea of what it looks like, this is kind of a stock-ish list for the moment. The general game plan is that you are trying to accelerate into a Primeval Titan and buy a little bit of time along the way using things like Abrupt Decay and Chalice of the Void. You are trying to use Once Upon a Time to give yourself added consistency, and you are ramping from 4 different angles. Angle 1 is soul lands. So specifically, you don't want to be playing City of Traders here for a number of reasons. One of the primary ones being that like Field of the Dead wants you to have all of your lands ever, and you really don't want to be losing them. Number 2, this deck is about accumulation of mana over time, not like one big burst of mana. So when you're playing something like Eldrazi, and you get to go turn 1 Mimic into turn 2 Thought-Knots here, that burst of mana is so important in a deck like this one. But in this deck, you would like to potentially cast multiple Primeval Titans, multiple large green suns, and things of that nature, and City of Traders doesn't really build towards that, and that's why you usually only see Ancient Tomb and not Cities in these deck lists. Although, like, I've seen a couple of lists with Cities, and they're probably not like the worst thing you could possibly be doing. Number 2, you have the Dryad-based ramp. And that's actually 2 different Dryads, because Dryad of the Elysian Grove is now a Dryad. Zoom in for me. Moto, zoom in. There we go. As of the last update, this is no longer just a nymph, it is a nymph Dryad. So, you can cast Green Sun for X equals 0 to get Dryad Arbor on turn 1, or you can cast a turn 2, potentially even turn 1, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, which lets you play an additional land, and also means that the lands you control are all basic land types. That's going to be important for a couple of different reasons. More on that in a minute. So an ideal sequence might look something like land pass, Ancient Tomb, Dryad, play an additional land, and then take a turn 3 Primeval Titan, which is really, really, really strong. There are like theoretical hands, I believe, that can produce a turn 2 Primeval Titan, but that's kind of like the magical Christmas land sorts of scenarios and probably aren't going to happen most of the time. In a lot of the games that I played, though, the turn 3 Primeval Titan isn't super realistic, because like your Dryad Arbor, your Dryad, your Ramunap, whatever you play out first is usually eating a counterspell or a piece of removal. So the magical Christmas land scenarios where everything goes correctly don't tend to happen all that often, because like discard, removal, and counterspells a good portion of the time end up interacting with you. So you're somewhat disruptible in terms of just being a straight combo deck. This is like definitely not one of the fastest or most consistent combo decks in Legacy. This is kind of a deck that has resilience. And I do think of it as sort of a combo deck where you're a 1-card combo, though. So your combo is just resolve Primeval Titan or Green Sun for X equals 6, and you have assembled your combo. There's a little bit more to it than that, and oftentimes you play out like a mid-range deck, but most of the games that you actually win, you're resolving Primeval Titan, and then your opponent dies within 2 turns. Or the game has effectively ended in that window. Sometimes it takes a while. There's 2 other pieces of ramp that are around. The next one is Mox Diamond. Many of the initial Titanic Dryad lists played the full playset of Mox Diamond, and more as time goes on, the number of Mox Diamonds that are appearing in the deck decreases. And that's because Mox Diamond was really good in this deck. Sorry, not really good. Really weird in this deck. You are expecting that, like, when you play Mox Diamond, you're, like, ramping ahead, and it's, like, 100% working towards your plan, right? That's not necessarily the case here. Because every land that you discard to Mox Diamond is a land that you're not just putting into play for Dryad. It's a land that won't contribute to your number of lands for something like Valakut the Molten Pinnacle or Field of the Dead. So Mox Diamond actually works in a negative way with some portions of your deck. That being said, lands that you discard to Mox Diamond can be played with Ramunap Excavator. And as sort of a cute little combo here, when you have both the Ramunap Excavator, which lets you play lands from your graveyard, and the Dryad, which lets you play additional lands, you can really get a lot of value out of your discarded lands. Say, for example, you have a nutty opener of like Ancient Tomb, Mox Diamond, discard a land, play Dryad on turn 1, play an additional land. Turn 2, play Ramunap, wasteland you, wasteland you, wasteland you, is something that can theoretically occur. Well, I guess the third wasteland is unnecessary in that hypothetical scenario because your opponent should only have 2 lands, but like, you get what I'm saying, right? So this is why Mox Diamond's numbers have been slowly decreasing over time. It's nice to have one, but you really don't want more than one in a game. And sometimes when you draw the Mox Diamond, you just won't play it because you're trying to contribute to the number of lands that you have for things like Valakut and Field of the Dead. So Mox Diamond ends up being one of those cards that's really strong in the opener, but pretty medium otherwise. The final one is Castle Garenbrig. And what you do is you pay 2 colorless, 2 green, and tap it to add 6 green mana to your mana pool, which conveniently casts Primeval Titan. So this is sort of interesting because this is a way to just turn 4 Primeval Titan. You just have like Ancient Tomb, green land, this as your 4 land drops, and as long as like one of those green lands is a forest so that this enters untapped, this theoretically accelerates you into Primeval Titan relatively early. I haven't had a lot of success with actually getting that to work for multiple reasons. Number one is that there's plenty of lands in this deck that aren't forests that cause this to enter tapped. So you have Ancient Tombs, Bojuka Bogs, Cavernous Souls, Field of the Dead, your fetch lands in cases where you haven't fetched, Vesuva sometimes, Wasteland. So there's a lot of times where this castle enters tapped and it's slightly awkward, just kind of due to the forest count. It's fine once you have a fetch land because all of your fetch lands get forests. Like there's not a basic swamp in this deck list or anything like that. But like it's one of those things that you need to be aware of in playing this card. The other thing is that Wasteland tends to stop this from 2 different directions. So if you play an Ancient Tomb out early to like say play something like Dryad, sometimes you'll just get like Wastelanded off the Ancient Tomb, and then actually making the castle work for your 6 mana is a lot harder. Similarly, this is a non-basic land, right? So this itself can just be Wastelanded. So if you're sitting at 3 lands plus this, and your opponent knows like that this could ramp you ahead, well, it's probably time to just Wasteland that. So theoretically cool, but with Wasteland as popular as it is, I don't know how frequently that actually ends up working. All right, so that's the ramp. Let's talk about payoff. Essentially, this deck has 8 payoff cards, and that's these 8 right here. In some cases, the stuff in this 3-drop column are payoff cards, but most of the time that's not true. In this deck, these cards are rarely winning the game by themselves. There are exceptions to this. So Dryad of the Elysian Grove plus Valakut the Molten Pinnacle means that this can realistically be a win condition. But a lot of the time, you're not getting like the 5 other mountains condition met and like still having gas to win the game afterwards without resolving one of these. So a lot of times, Dryad into one of these is a 1-2 punch that ends the game either instantly or almost instantly. but Dryad rarely just wins on its own. The same is true of Tireless Tracker. The 3-drop cards tend to be removal magnets. If you'll notice, there's no creatures at CMC 1 or 2 to sort of like eat removal before these come down. So if you're trying to treat one of these as your win conditions, and then your opponent goes, "Oh, Swords of Plowshares," like you're not getting the true payoff. So most of the time you need to draw one of these 8 cards to win the game, and luckily Once Upon a Time can help smooth out both your openers and help you dig for Primeval Titan once you've sort of bridged your way to the mid-game using things like Decay and Chalice. So when you resolve one of these 2 spells, most of the time you're going and looking for Field of the Dead and a Valakut. If you already have the Dryad, then there are times where you're going to go for double Valakut, and obviously there are fringe scenarios where you're going to want other stuff. So for example, there will be times where you just grab double Wasteland to try and mana screw your opponent. There will be times where you have a Dryad in hand, so you get like 1 Valakut and a Cavern of Souls to resolve the Dryad the next turn. Like there's all sorts of fringe scenarios, but most of the time I found myself looking for 1 Field of the Dead and 1 Valakut. Common exceptions were like my opponent is playing a Snapcaster Mage deck and they have a Swords of Plowshares in the graveyard, so I'll take like Field of the Dead plus Bojuka Bog to make it so that their Snapcaster doesn't work towards removing my Primeval Titan. So there are definitely things to think about in terms of what you fetch with Primeval Titan. But most of the time you are looking to just grind out your opponents once you have resolved Primeval Titan. Because even if they answer it, if Field of the Dead is in play, the game usually will favor you. So every land that you draw after you have Field of the Dead is just going to end up being a 2/2 black zombie creature token most of the time. And when you have 30 lands and say you've used 5 of your lands or so, now let's say you have a full 6 lands in hand in play that work towards casting this Primeval Titan. That means you still have 24 lands in your deck that have now just become 24 spells that say, when you play this, get a 2/2 zombie for free. And that's really strong against these fair blue decks. And this is the whole reason why the Titanic Dryad archetype exists. The 4-color snow decks that until very, very recently were the most dominant deck in the format had basically no ability to interact with Field of the Dead at all. That means that once that sucker was in play, there was nothing that they could do. So against these decks, very frequently, you would actually just get Field of the Dead and Vesuva, and you would copy the Field of the Dead with Vesuva, and all of a sudden you have this super inevitability engine versus them, where every land is instead 2 2/2 zombies. And sometimes those games would go on for a long time because of the existence of Oko and Uro, but you almost always got to grind through. Especially since, again, they can't interact with your lands, so Cavern of Souls meant that the Primeval Titans were going to be uncounterable as the game went on and on. So the reason to play Titanic Dryad is this inevitability. However, Titanic Dryad has some serious issues against combo, in my opinion, especially non-graveyard-based combo. If we look at the main deck, the number of cards you have against combo are 4. You have Chalice of the Void, and that's it. There's no Green Sun Silver Bullet that's really good against combo decks. And as far as your lands go, yes, you have the Singleton Bojuka Bog that might be good against combo decks, but unless you naturally draw it, you don't have things like crop rotation to accelerate that into play. So when you play a deck like Titanic Dryad, you're saying, I don't think that I am going to get paired against combo very frequently in this event. And Titanic Dryad is very good at going over the top of other fair decks. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a future section, but I think right now combo is really on the uptick due to the presence of companions, and I think Titanic Dryad is going to have to adapt or die. It's unfortunate, but I kind of think that's where we're at right now in terms of costs. and it's not like Titanic Dryad is going to get its own, nifty companion, because the generic green beater companion, the elk, says that you can't play double converted mana costs in your deck, and this is like built around Primeval Titan and Chalice of the Void, and like Titania is super common in the sideboard as well, and sometimes the main deck, honestly. So I don't think this this deck is getting much from Ikoria, is kind of what I'm getting at here. All right, let's start talking about build variants. There's 4 that I want to talk about, and I have deck lists for 3 of them. Originally, this deck started out as a mono green deck, but the deck had 2 problems when it was mono green. Problem number 1 was you were still bad against combo, and problem number 2 was that you were bad against aggressive Delver starts because you didn't have literally any way to interact with your opponent outside of like Wastelands. So, porting this deck into green-black, which actually wasn't all that hard on the mana, meant that you made yourself a little bit worse against opposing Wastelands, but you made yourself so much better at having an angle of interaction with decks that have permanents. And this is the reason why I don't even have a mono green deck list up here, is I just think the mono green version is dead. I think the green black version or the bug versions are just going to be better. In the rock paper scissors game that is Legacy, it's okay to be weak to like one macro archetype, I think, but when you start taking on weaknesses against multiple macro archetypes, you've got serious problems. So if you're bad against combo and you're bad against Delver, and you don't have much interaction for your opponents, and you're not like just getting your opponent dead super, super, super quickly, like you've got some questionable deck building choices in all likelihood. And so I think the black-green version ends up in a much, much better spot. The Black Splash lends itself to some sideboard cards, but you don't usually play all that many black cards because you are still like very much a green-based deck. And if you look at the mana sources, like there's 4 Ancient Tombs here. Bojuka Bog enters tapped. Cavernous Souls are colorless. Field of the Dead is colorless. Vesuva enters tapped and is maybe colorless or green. Wastelands are colorless. So you don't want to be playing anything like Thoughtseize, like A, because you're a Chalice deck, and B, because turn 1 black mana is pretty hard. So a lot of times you'll only just see a couple more like permanent-based answers in the sideboard, and Vraska Golgari Queen often just functions as double Abrupt Decay, which is already the thing that you wanted from this deck. In playing with it, I found Vraska a touch awkward because like I lacked the ability to protect it, so sometimes it was just like singular Abrupt Decay plus gain a couple of life, and I wasn't super impressed by that. Yeah, let's look at the next build now. And let me do a little bit of moving around, try to get this to look a little bit better on screen. That should do. Okay, note that this is basically the same deck list as before, but we've just squeezed in a couple copies of Uro. Now, again, prior to Ikoria hitting, Uro Oko was one of the best things that you can be doing. And so if you're in a green-blue deck, it's not surprising to see one or both of those cards. Uro is 100% on theme with this deck. It draws cards. That's important. We don't have a lot of that. It gains life. Again, stabilizing is something we do in the late game, and aggressive Delver starts and such can be scary. And it also ramps you. So this is a 3-mana Explore with upside in this deck that also becomes an additional threat. So notice we've dropped 1 Primeval Titan when we've added 2 Uros. The Uros have negative synergy with Ramunap Excavator, but positive synergy with much of the rest of the stuff that's going on with this deck. One thing I dislike about this build, though, is that it can be kind of hard to get the 5 cards from Graveyard for Escape if your opponents aren't helping. If your opponents are like countering your stuff, destroying your stuff, wastelanding you, then getting the Uros back is like totally fine and reasonable. But if we look at the cards that put themselves into the graveyards naturally, many of the cards in this deck don't do that. They're lands that sit around, or they're sorceries that shuffle back into your deck. So it's really Once Upon a Time, Abrupt Decay, and your fetch lands that are traditionally going to the graveyard. So I think Uro here is much worse than Uro in the various cantrip decks, but the card is still just absolutely stupid powerful. So I'm not surprised to see it show up here. More of the Titanic Dryad lists than not that I've been playing against have this light splash. The opportunity cost is really low, and the ability to just board into Oko to deal with any sort of fair deck is pretty strong. Notice that this blue deck list has sort of taken a little bit more respect for combo decks by also trying to play Trinisphere, which again is either a turn 1 on sort of like the nuts or turn 2 play most of the time, and that can be pretty strong. I don't have too much else to say about the blue base build. Like, you're splashing blue for 2 cards, and it doesn't require a super overhaul of the mana base in order to do so. So like it's essentially 2 drops as what you've added in, I believe at the cost of 2 of the forests. So the previous deck list that I had up had 2 forests, 2 snow-covered forests. This has 2 tropical islands. Having Tropical Island does help make Field of the Dead a little bit better, and this list also has 2 Field of the Dead, which I like, and I think a lot of the mono green lists should have 2 Field of the Deads. Not all of them do, but many do at this point. There's one other thing that I want to show off that I got paired against on Magic Online, and I absolutely knew that I had to include it in this video after that happened. And that's this really cool Rug Natural Order variant of this deck list. Let me just confirm that all is on screen. Yes. Okay, so I was playing against KCC, and they busted out this deck list, which absolutely threw me for a loop. I don't know that I would still 100% classify this as Titanic Dryad, because it's definitely doing its own thing. But since I was doing a primer on the archetype, and it's still a Dryad Primeval Titan Green Sun deck, I figured it was worth talking about. This deck list is radically different in that it has a slightly lower to the ground combo finish. So instead of always trying to grind your opponent out via Field of the Dead and Primeval Titan, this deck seeks to win the game a little bit earlier by putting a Titania into play and creating a bunch of elementals, or casting a Natural Order off some sort of smaller green creature for a Progenitus, which gets there the vast majority of the time. So this deck list ends up being more of a Green Sun Toolbox Natural Order deck, and if I had to give this a name, I would call this Rug Natural Order, or Rug Natural Order Valakut, or something like that. This deck list also does something cool in that it has a Burning Wish package, which most notably gets you a copy of Natural Order, one of your win conditions, or Scape Shift. And Scape Shift plus Dryad gets you your Valakuts, and it's all sorts of nasty. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but I figured when doing a primer on the archetype, I really needed to mention this because it's neat. This is also one of those things where you will get your opponents because they do not know what's going on. They might think you're doing this whole Titanic Dryad thing, or they might think you're some sort of Rug Snow deck, and then all of a sudden Primeval Titan or Progenitus has come out to play, and everything is a disaster. This deck does have some things going for it as opposed to the Titanic Dryad deck, and that's that you actually get some 2-drop and 1-drop creatures that matter. So we look at your Green Suns as you go up the curve. It's Dryad into Bird, into Oof, Soccer Tribe Elder, Scavenging Ooze, Icefang Coatl, into basically all the stuff that you saw previously, plus a couple more. So this is a super, super cool brew That is very much on theme for the Titanic Dryad deck. All right, let's go back to the stock green deck for a minute and talk a little bit more about sideboards now. The sideboards for these decks often look a little bit wonky. 4 Leyline of the Void is sort of a starting point for these. And then after that, it's usually about 3 to 5 additional creatures that are Green Sun Zenith targets. Collector Oof being the most common and most important of them, but things like Reclamation Sage, Ramunap, Tireless Tracker, Titania are pretty common in these slots. Afterwards, it's usually a couple more assorted cards to board in for fair and unfair matchups. So Vraska is filling the role of fair hate cards here. And Ensnaring Bridge, I guess, is sort of the unfair card. I'm guessing that when this deck list was put together, maybe some things like, say, Depths or Show and Tell were popular, and so Ensnaring Bridge was the go-to target to beat those. And like Caracas is something that also like helps to deal with both of those same things, which is kind of what I see when I'm looking at this. But when we look at other sideboards, you can see that like there's some flexibility in what you put in here. So like Scavenging Ooze was a bullet that was in this list that wasn't in the others, and this list went a little heavier on the black to have Plague Engineer as a sideboard card for the fair decks, and then it's like Trinisphere for the unfair decks. So again, when you're building your sideboards for these decks, a lot of it is going to be very sort of like in flux, where you need to be aware of what fair and unfair decks are at the top of the metagame, and you need to adjust these slots appropriately. It may seem really weird to put Ensnaring Bridge in your Primeval Titan deck, but the thing to remember is that Primeval Titan fetches Field of the Dead or Valakut, and both of these things can really work around the Ensnaring Bridge. So Valakut plus Dryad will just kill your opponent with lightning bolts to the face, or you kind of like keep your hand size low until you have enough zombies to kill your opponent with Field of the Dead zombies. So you just go like, draw a card for turn, I'm up to 2, attack you with a bunch of zombies, play a land, I'm back down to 1, you probably can't attack, pass the turn. And so you kind of play Sword and Shield with it. You can also just like Abrupt Decay or Reclamation Sage your own bridge if you need to swing through for lethal. So like you do have outs to your own bridge. It's not necessarily the end of the world. Although it was super weird when I first saw the deck list. It didn't make a lot of sense to me at the time. And then I thought about it more, and it was actually fine. Okay, so let's kind of go to the like deck list adjustment and food for thought section of this now. With many of the Titanic Dryad builds, I don't think Green Sun is particularly good in the early game, which is really unfortunate. So on turn 1, if you're not chalicing, then Green Sun gets Dryad Arbor, and that is great. But I found that in games where I had Dryad Arbor in my opener or drew Dryad Arbor, the Green Suns became a dead card, and I mean just stone cold dead, because I needed 4 mana in order for them to do anything. And Green Sun wasn't able to bridge me towards these. And I found that super awkward. So I kind of feel like some of these decks need to have at least one more Green Sun target between 0 and 3, just so there's something else to fetch. Spoilers, I think it's Collector Oof, but we'll talk about that more in a minute when I start talking about like metagaming this deck list for the post-Ikoria world. But I really see the hole in this CMC range as being a problem for Green Sun. Not being able to just cast this for something that matters is really devastating in the early game. And when you're trying to make it to the late game to play these like big dumb giants, this card not being able to do a ton early is rough. Okay, when you're playing against a lightning bolt deck and you're casting a green sun, you actually have quite a bit to think about in terms of like what you want to play around. So, like, let's say you're playing against Delver. Ramonak Excavator is awesome versus Delver because you can wasteland them out and you can protect yourself from wasteland. But this thing dies to bolt, whereas something like Dryad of the Elysian Grove or Courser of Kufrix would not. So you want to keep in mind whether or not you've given your opponent an opportunity to lightning bolt something yet when you're thinking about what you're fetching with Green Sun. Now, early on in the game, it's very frequently going to be like you want to get the Dryad to ramp, but in the mid game it gets a little bit trickier, especially if you do have like a juicy wasteland in your graveyard or something like that, or like maybe your Cavernous Souls has been wastelanded and you really want to get that back. So if you are going to fetch Ramonak Excavator, make sure the first thing that you do after getting it is making your land drop for turn from your graveyard. And like, don't autopilot and just like play a land from your hand thinking, oh, I'll just play that later. You want to get your value immediately so that like when they get priority, they can't just like lightning bolt it and you haven't actually gotten anything out of your 4-mana investment. And so awkwardly, that means that if you do want to Green Sun for Ramonak, sometimes it means like waiting one more turn than you normally might, so you get guaranteed value out of it. And then like there's days stuff to consider as well, but like you kind of get the general idea of what I'm talking about here. Okay, next thing that's important. Cards like Valakut and Field of the Dead are going to check upon resolution whether or not their condition is actually true. So let's say you Primeval Titan for 2 Valakuts and you control like 10 lands. If your Dryad is removed prior to the Valakut triggers resolving, you don't actually end up getting that damage. Similarly, for some reason, if Field of the Dead triggers, but then when it resolves, you actually control fewer than 7 or more lands with different names, you're not getting those zombies. So something that I did in a league when I was streaming was I played Misty Rainforest as a 7th land. My opponent interacted with me in some way, and so I wanted to fetch, and I ended up fetching a forest when I already had a forest, and therefore when Field of the Dead resolved, I actually cost myself 2, or it might have even have been, yeah, I think it was 2 zombies, because I had like copied Field of the Dead or something like that. So just kind of like be aware, and there's going to be some spots where you might have a very attractive Valakut play, but you might have a safer play that resolves around some other card that doesn't expose you to something like Swords to Plowshares or Lightning Bolt or Abrupt Decay on the Dryad. So that's something you really, really need to be cognizant of. The other thing to be cognizant of is your sequencing. So it's very easy to be in the wrong mindset with this deck list because oftentimes you are not going to have black mana in the early game. I know this sounds stupid to say, but this turns all of your lands into lands of every basic land type. And don't forget that, because that means you can tap something like Forest and Wasteland to Abrupt Decay. And you might be in the mindset of, I have not had mana for this Abrupt Decay in 10 turns, so I can't cast it. But then once you resolve a Dryad, you actually can. And it's really easy to forget that. It was one of those things that I was very much intellectually aware of, and then when I was like in games and recording or streaming, it was much harder for me to just like stay locked onto that idea when I wasn't using like 100% of my brain power towards just playing the game. All right, as far as moving this deck forward goes, there are 3 companions that are really warping the game right now. Lurrus, Zerda, and Gyruda. And against 2.5 of these, Collector Oof is really good. So I think in order to stay competitive with all of these combo decks, this deck needs to have at least one and probably multiple main deck Collector Oofs. At the very least, you want to have one as a Green Sun target. I think that's very, very important. Because off Ancient Tomb, that can just be like Forest Pass, Ancient Tomb, Green Sun for 2, and there's your turn 2 oof that might be locking your opponent out of the game. So the Lurrus Storm decks, like Ant and TES, like oof is a beating against them. Against the Zerda, like Bomberman style decks, if you get that down early, it oftentimes will just win the game on its own. And against Gyruda, it's really hard to cast that big stupid demon if you can't use the artifact mana. And since you're a Wasteland deck, you can often keep them off of blue or black to like make sure that they can't cast it and win the game. Now, as it stands now, this deck is a Mox Diamond deck. And I haven't seen anyone else do this yet, but my thought is, why not Simian Spirit Guide? It is like kind of worse in many ways, because like Mox Diamond is recurring ramp, which is something this deck definitely wants. But if this deck wants to play multiple Collector Oofs to just like increase the chance of being able to play them on turn 1 even, off just like Land Spirit Guide, then I don't think it's crazy to cut the Mox Diamonds from the deck. They're not particularly good in the first place. So I think this deck could make 1 or 2 spell-based cuts for a couple of Collector Oofs, and then like drop a land and play something like 2 to 3 Spirit Guides. And I think that might be a really good way to push this deck forward, and I don't know that it's going to be one of the better things that you can be doing in the format, but like if you want to continue to play this deck, I think that's the primary direction that you should be exploring. Similarly, since you are an Ancient Tomb deck list, you can also consider Null Rod in the sideboard. And I'm very, very high on Null Rod and Collector Oof right now. I'm recommending shoving them into every single deck possible. A side upside of playing Collector Oof in the main deck is also for the Lurrus Grixis Delver lists. You also just get to shut down the Bauble Recursion, which gets super annoying with Sprite Dragon very, very quickly. On that note, 4 Abrupt Decays is like maybe enough when paired with Chalice of the Void to let you do enough things versus Delver to get to the end game. But I'm not necessarily sure that that's still true when Sprite Dragon is around. Sprite Dragon's terrifying for this deck because there are no flyers. And so if your opponent just goes turn 2 Sprite Dragon, dazes your turn 3 play, like Force of Will's your turn 4 play or something like that, cast a couple cantrips somewhere in there, like that thing will get to Primeval Titan size, and you have no ability to interact with it other than just Abrupt Decay. So I don't know the exact answer to that problem, but it's something that I would be thinking about if you wanted to continue playing this deck. Like maybe you want to be playing an Assassin's Trophy or 2, either main or side, to have more answers. Maybe if you're playing Plague Engineer, you end up putting that on Dragon before a Sprite Dragon is on board to keep that thing from getting out of hand. I don't know what the answer is, but that's something that I very much would be thinking about if I were you. And kind of like the last note here is that I don't think this deck list as it stands now is super competitive in Legacy. The past week and a half has been absolutely crazy in terms of the amount of change that Legacy has undergone. And Ikoria is one of the most powerful sets that I've ever seen in terms of the amount of change that it has given to a format and the speed at which that change occurred. So Chalice on 0 is super strong in the current metagame, maybe even more so than Chalice on 1, which is like blasphemy. But I think this deck list needs more interaction versus some of those fast combo decks. I don't think it would be crazy to consider something like Mindbreak Traps in the sideboard either. That's something that a lot of the fair decks like Humans are trying out. but like it's definitely a scary world out there, and it often feels like if you're not playing a companion, you're making a mistake. So you need to have a very good reason for playing Titanic Dryad if you want to do so moving forward. And this is not the tone that I thought I would be taking when I received the donation to record this video. Like I was very excited about Titanic Dryad. I thought the deck was like very, very interesting. It was attacking from a cool angle. It was a great way to grind out the blue decks. And then all of a sudden, Ikoria comes out, and the numbers on Oko like absolutely plummet as people start picking up Zerda, Lurrus, and Gyruda instead. We will see a slight temporary dip in Gyruda, seeing as it got banned due to a bug on Magic Online, but it should be unbanned and back to normal within about a week. So if you're playing Titanic Dryad, you get a little bit of time to think and explore the format a little bit before Gyruda comes back. And you want to figure out, what am I going to be doing to fight against these degenerate combo decks? And I also wouldn't be surprised if the Karakas that is currently in the sideboard makes its way to the main deck. Right now we're even seeing Grixis Delver playing main deck Karakas, partially because it casts Lurrus, and partially because bouncing opposing companions is very important. All right, I think that's all I have to say about Titanic Dryad today. I hope you all have enjoyed this primer. I think it probably ended up being about 45 minutes, and I kind of aim for the 45-minute to an hour range when I set up to do one of these primers. I hope you all have enjoyed and gotten something useful out of it. Cheers, and I hope you are enjoying Magic.